Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining for another Ask Miss Jai live. I am very excited to be here with you again for another week, for another opportunity for us to have great conversations and chat through some of the questions that I've received this week. I am hoping that by the end of today's conversation, you will know a little bit more on how to address stereotypes or misinformation about trans and non-binary people in the workplace, a little bit more around how to support patients and clients who have shared their histories with multiple providers so that we're not having folks rehash the same story over and over, and a little bit better about how we can, as individuals, create systemic and organizational change and what that can look like for us, and how we can participate in that. So I'm very excited to talk about all these things today on Ask Miss Jai Live. I'm very excited to be here with you on this Sunday. If you are joining me live right now via Instagram or LinkedIn or Facebook, please feel free to drop a hashtag live in the chat so I can see that you're here. Send me a wave, say hello. I'd love to hear from you all. If you're catching this on the replay, then go ahead and put a hashtag replay in the comments. I'd also love to hear what you found most helpful from today's conversation. Again, hello everyone. My name is Miss Jai. I use feminine and masculine pronouns, so I use she, her, and he, him. I am a sexual health educator and infectious disease public health expert. I have dedicated a little over the last 10 years to engaging around trans and non-binary communities with health providers and teaching folks how to support trans and non-binary people in health settings, oftentimes because there was little to no information available to my colleagues. And so it kind of fell into my wheelhouse and my passions and my interests. The Ask Miss Jai Live started as a way to address some of the most frequent questions that come up and ongoing questions that come up for you all around how to support trans and non-binary people in our health environments. When I talk about health environments or health settings, I talk about that holistically. So it could be for service providers who are providing public health services, for folks who are providing shelter services, for folks who are providing medical services or mental health or behavioral health services. So health is kind of all encompassing of what that can look like for folks. And the a lot of these questions came up as a result of individual trainings that were happening, but I started to notice a trend that those questions were coming up pretty frequently and wanted to make sure that if one group had these questions, then likely multiple groups had these questions and multiple people had these questions. So this is a way for us to come together and learn a little bit collectively as well. And hello, I see people waving. It's lovely to see you. So this is a way for us to put this information all in one place for us to reference back to, and also recognize that as we learn more, this information may change as well. So with today's question, before we jump into today's questions, I do want to make an announcement as well. I'm very excited that next week's Ask Miss Jai Live is going to be an interview with Josie Caballero, the director of the U.S. Transgender Survey from the National Center for Transgender Equality. So I'm very excited that we will have the opportunity to ask some questions of Josie, learn a little bit more about the survey and why it's important and necessary, and how we can get more folks engaged in that process as well. If you have known me for a little bit, if you've seen any of the work that I've done, or if we've talked on a professional level, then likely you've heard me mention the US Transgender Survey. It's the largest survey of its kind for transgender and non-binary people throughout the United States. And it is the closest thing that we have to population level data, because trans identity is not collected on the census and it's not collected on a number of other larger population level surveys. So this is a way for us to get better understanding of what we're experiencing as a group and as a collective of people, and where we can invest information and invest resources in order to make sure that our health needs are being met. So very excited about that. That will be next Sunday, September 4th at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So please tune in and join us for a conversation around the U.S. Transgender Survey. So let's go ahead and jump into some questions this week. Again, thank you everyone who submitted questions. If you have questions for how you can, as service providers, support trans and non-binary people, specific situations that may have come up, or more generalized questions as well, please feel free to direct message them to me through either Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn. I'd be happy to answer those live on this show. If you have questions as we're talking as well, please feel free to send a message or send them in the chat, and we'll hopefully have time to answer those on the call as well, or on the live as well. So the first question that came up was, how do I learn about a patient or client's history without making them share their story all over again? This is a great question. As if you were on my social media this week, you may have seen that there was a variety of conversation happening around this specifically in from both the patient perspective of what it's like to have to tell our story over and over again, especially for those of us who are experiencing chronic illness or are experiencing frequent contact with medical establishments, that it can be very difficult for us to have to share our same health story over and over. But we also heard from folks from the perspective of what it means to collect data, what it means for us to make sure that health records are complete, and how that can look for us. So, from a provider perspective, what I have experienced in the Southwest and Arizona specifically is that generally we may be requesting medical records, but oftentimes we're going through the health assessment questions again within our clinic because we have control over that data, we have control over that information, and how we are then inputting that information into our systems. So there's a couple of things that I'd like us to think about it from both perspectives. So from a provider perspective, it could be very challenging if we don't have complete health information for us to make healthcare decisions collaboratively with our patient. From the patient perspective, having to rehash the same health story becomes can become challenging, especially if that health story includes trauma or the experiences of trauma at the hands of medical providers, or trauma as experiencing life with chronic health conditions, or experiencing life as trans and non-binary people in a society that devalues and harms trans and non-binary people. So it can be difficult to have to rehash that story again as well. So some of the ways that we can help to alleviate this as providers, while also getting the information that is still necessary for us to collect, is thinking about what it is that we are trying to collect. So are we doing a health assessment that is going to actually give us information around what we're going to be focusing on today at this appointment? Are we asking generalized health history questions? Are we asking generalized family health questions? What How will that impact to today's appointment, or how will that impact today's ability to provide care? Because if we know that we are asking a variety of questions that are just to sort of put together a profile, and that aren't going to necessarily impact the care that we'll be working through with the patient today, then that is an opportunity for us to say, we're not going to collect this information today. Instead, we are going to get your signature so we can request your medical records from your previous health providers. We're going to do our due diligence to try and get this information so that you don't have to continually repeat all of the same information that you've had to give us in the past. Or that you've had to give to past providers. So we're not going to go into necessarily a history of familial cancer, because that information is already present in another medical record that we can request and get from a provider. From another provider. And having the patient present there with us means that we can also get the signatures required and the information required in order to request those medical records. The other piece is recognizing how difficult it is generally for patients to request medical records of a provider, that it really is much easier oftentimes for a medical center to request medical records from another medical center, especially when we're looking at large level providers. So, our medical homes that are multidisciplinary, are for-profit hospitals, the organizations that have many moving pieces. It's generally much more difficult for a patient to figure out even where to go in order to request that information instead of just signing off and allowing the medical provider to request that information specifically. The other thing that we can think about when it comes to asking about history, or talking to a patient about the history, is also asking permission of the patient to discuss a history. So before we get into telling a patient, okay, these are the assessment questions we're going to ask, we can just ask the patient or the client flat out, are you comfortable with answering health history questions today? Are you comfortable with us creating a profile for you today? Do you have any health concerns that you want to make sure are addressed before we do the health history components? That can give some ownership to the patient around the way that the appointment is going to go. It helps to build trust and rapport with the patient or the client. It also shows the patient or the client that you're invested in their health and wellness, in the specifically in the ways that they are also invested in their health and wellness. So if we come forward and we say, let's go through this health history assessment together, and that's not on on the patient or the client's concerns for today, that they are more concerned about something that is more pressing, then we can instead shift and focus on that more pressing need, showing the patient that we care about addressing their needs first, and that the paperwork and the checkboxing, that even though we know that's important, that that really can come secondary to providing patient-centered care. The other thing that I would ask us to think about is that we also offer, for our patients. So sometimes, depending on, or our patients or our clients, depending on where we are in the system. So if we're doing primary care, or general care, if we're doing family care, if we are doing maybe OBGYN care, also offering for the patient to send them from the visit, or send post visit a copy of the notes that they from that visit itself, a copy of the medical information from that visit itself, because that also puts some power into the patient or the client's hands, so they can start collecting and keeping this medical information in a way that they can then go to another provider and share that information with the provider as well. So, even though we might be working in the same system, I think about the health center that I worked at, for the last 5 years or so. We had a shift in medical record systems. And when we had that shift, all of our notes were dumped into one location. So it was one screen that had all of our physician notes, they had all of our case management notes, our phone calls, our attempts to reach. If the or client was hospitalized at all, it had all the blood pressure readings, the suicidality screenings, the any sort of blood work that was taking place. It was all in the same location. And as a result of that, it was helpful that we had all of this data. However, what I found is that providers oftentimes wouldn't look back, past their generally their own note, or they would only review their own note. And so it was almost like we were leapfrogging information, and missing key pieces that might have happened, or other physicians' notes. So there was a lack of communication amongst providers as a result of not reading notes from other medical appointments. So if we offer to our patients to be able to take documentation with them, or to take a summary of the visit or the health goals, or whatever components might be helpful for other providers to see, then we are providing patients with control over what they are able to bring into their next visit. We're providing them control over how they're going to frame their next visit as well, because they will likely provide this information first. And for folks who are watching this who have chronic health conditions, this is also a helpful way that you can start to build a binder for yourself that includes this information, includes things like regular general medications that you're taking. It includes information on who your primary care physician is. It includes what surgeries you might have had. So all of that is already collected, and you don't have to go through that information again. And I've known folks to take that information to their provider's office and just say, here's my information, read over it in front of me, and then we can talk about what questions you have. So it shifts up that ability to advocate for ourselves a little bit. Hello, thank you for joining on Instagram. Again, my name is Miss Jai, so thank you for folks who are joining right now. We're wrapping up this first question, and then we'll get into some additional questions. So I think that those are some effective steps that we can take to provide folks, both from the provider standpoint. So we're still collecting the information that is necessary, but we're prioritizing the patient in the appointment and in the visit. We're prioritizing their care and their needs. And what we're going to be addressing first off, and especially for new visits, which is where this might happen more frequently, is in a new visit. I think it's important for us to build and establish that rapport and establish that expectation that the patient or the client's needs and the patient or the client's concerns are going to come first, above and beyond all checkboxing or all forms or all of these pieces that might just that might reduce us just to a cog in a machine or a number on a piece of paper. And so I think that that's a really helpful way for us to frame a visit while still collecting the information we need to. And then from the patient perspective, it's also helpful for us to be given information, both physical information and information about ways that we can advocate for ourselves within the medical setting. Because oftentimes in medical settings, as patients, we feel that our autonomy is stripped from us, it's taken from us. Medical decisions are made for us. And so if we develop this collaborative rapport, then we are able to actually approach other medical providers with that expectation and let them know what we are looking for by way of a medical provider. My primary care physician is very collaborative with me in the healthcare that they provide. We talk about what the health plan is and decide on what's going to work for me, and is also medically informed. I would like that with you as a specialist, or I would like that with you as my endocrinologist. So there's ways that we can start to advocate for ourselves by modeling it, or as providers, modeling this structure. We are also giving tools to our patients to advocate for that for themselves. The next question I have is, how do I address stereotypes and misinformation spread by my coworkers about trans and non-binary people? So this is also a great question. It's also one that I think can be a bit tricky to answer. So I think there's a couple of ways that we can think about this. Um, First, I think it's helpful for us to recognize that not all misinformation or stereotypes is shared in a way that is to do harm, or shared in a way that is deliberately trying to be harmful to a community. Sometimes we hear information and that information sticks in our brain and we tell ourselves that it's fact. And then something comes up in conversation and we regurgitate that information thinking that it's fact. So I want us to be really mindful that because someone shares a stereotype or shares misinformation about the trans and non-binary community in a conversation, doesn't mean necessarily that they know that that is misinformation or a stereotype, or that they are trying to share it as a way to be harmful. So we can approach with compassion in those situations. And I think that one of the great ways that we can approach those conversations is by asking questions. So if we hear something that we know is misinformation, if we hear something that we know is a stereotype, then we can approach with questions like, "Oh, I haven't heard that before. Where did you hear that? Oh, I wasn't, I learned something different. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you mean by that?" These are ways that we can open up conversation, and it allows us as the person who has said the stereotype or said the misinformation, it allows us the opportunity to reflect on what we've just said, in order to think a little bit more critically about it. Because sometimes this is like a knee jerk reaction or a knee jerk regurgitation of that information. So if we're asking questions, it generally highlights that there's something that doesn't make sense about what has just been said. So, approaching those conversations with questions can be helpful. It can also be helpful to approach these conversations individually as opposed to in a group setting. Sometimes, when we are called in for a conversation around stereotypes or misinformation, or acting or behaving in racist or sexist or homophobic or transphobic ways, it can be difficult for we sometimes can become very defensive when we're called in a group setting. It's almost like this response to save face, as a result of embarrassment or as a result of recognizing that we've made like a social misstep. And so it can sometimes be more helpful for us to have a one-on-one conversation, and approach that conversation with I statements and recognizing that this individual may not know how that information has impacted you. So I felt really confused when you shared this information, or I felt hurt when you shared these stereotypes about trans people that aren't true, or I felt uncomfortable when you started talking about trans and non-binary people in this way because X, Y, and Z. So that can help us to open up those conversations and also approach the conversations in a way that hopefully will help to actually like move that needle into understanding as opposed to eliciting a response that is immediately combative or is immediately defensive. The other thing is that when we are having those conversations, I think it's helpful for us to approach not only using I statements, but also saying um, why it is that this was a stereotype or why it was that this was a misinformation. So for and these can be things that are also small, not smaller, but are not stereotypes or misinformation specifically. So let's say I'm working with a provider and that provider misgenders a patient that I know is trans. Um, it can be appropriate for me to say, I felt uncomfortable when you were using he and him with this patient because that patient is trans and uses she and her. And I just wanted to make sure that I told you that because I didn't know if you were aware of that information. And I wanted to make sure that you were aware. So it's important for us to follow up with the why of why it is that we want to share this information, because I think that that brings us into a conversation around it as opposed to just saying, I feel hurt or I feel uncomfortable because you did this thing, and then doesn't allow the opportunity to express why that thing was challenging or why that thing was misinformation or a stereotype. The other thing is when we hear misinformation, it can also just be helpful to correct it in the moment, depending on what is being said and how it's being said. So if someone says, for example, that let's say I'm again in like let's say I'm in a mental health facility and I'm working with front desk staff, and someone says, oh well, I just collect their insurance card because their insurance card will, and that's how I create their profile because the insurance card will always have the patient's name and gender and that information. Then we can help correct that information in the moment and say, well, actually, something to consider is that trans and non-binary people might not have a legal name that reflects their current name and may not have a legal gender marker that reflects their current gender. And so, and maybe instead of taking that information and using that to build out the profile, we can ask folks to write down their name and their current gender identity, or write down their name and write down their legal name, and collect information in a different way. So that way we're not making assumptions about the person that's sitting in front of us. So that helps to correct the misinformation in the moment. And it also doesn't put the individual on the spot for having this misconception in their head. And then we don't continue down this path of continuing to collect information in this way, knowing that it is going to be it's going to potentially be off-putting for trans and non-binary people. So the correction of misinformation in the moment can be very helpful in preventing further harm or the potential for harm in our health settings. And then the final thing I'll say about correcting misinformation and stereotypes is that we also have to be mindful of power dynamics in the workplace. Because working in health settings means that there is the potential, well, working in really any setting, there's the potential for power dynamics in the ways that we approach information. I may be able to approach as a medical assistant, I might be able to approach another medical assistant when I hear stereotypes or when I hear misinformation, but I might feel really uncomfortable approaching a physician on my floor as a medical assistant, or I might have already been discouraged in the past from approaching a physician directly as a medical assistant because I'm not seen as an authority in this sense. And so I think we also, in thinking about power dynamics, it's important for us to recognize if a power dynamic is in play. And if there is a power dynamic in play, where can we go in order to make sure that that misinformation is not doing harm or is not spreading, or that the stereotypes that are present are being actively addressed on a larger level. So in that same situation, I said around the medical assistant and maybe not feeling comfortable of approaching a provider. An alternative would be maybe approaching my supervisor and asking my supervisor for training for our staff on working with trans and non-binary folks because of stereotypes that have been witnessed, or approaching the physician's supervisor and saying, "Hey, I've noticed these things and I'm concerned. Maybe you would want to talk to your provider. You'll want to talk to your employee about this, especially if I've been discouraged in the past from bringing information directly to the provider." It becomes a bit challenging um, working in a setting where there are very strong power dynamics um, to have really direct conversations and bring direct feedback to one another, because it's direct feedback is often discouraged either through social contract. So maybe we are actively maybe we receive aggression whenever we bring direct feedback, or we've been reprimanded in the past for bringing direct feedback. So because of those things, I think it's really important for us to be mindful if there is a power dynamic in play and what it means for us to bring this information and where we should bring that information if it's discouraged for us to address it directly with the individual. And then the other thing I'll say is that for providers who are listening in on this, I highly encourage us to think about the ways that we receive feedback, and really shift from receiving feedback, and maybe it's not shift. I would like us to think about receiving feedback as an opportunity for us to continue to grow and provide the best services possible to the patients that we are engaging with every day. Because I think sometimes feedback is seen as a way to call out deficit, or it's perceived as a way to call out deficit, and um, it becomes really challenging when folks feel that way, to provide feedback in a way that is going to be helpful, but also to provide feedback in a way that is going to be heard and incorporated. So if instead we shift for ourselves our perspective on what feedback means, and feedback means that we are going to be continually improving, continually changing these nuances in the ways that we interact and engage with folks, so that we are able to better serve the people that we are seeing, and in turn increase their health opportunities and increase their health outcomes, or improve their health outcomes, then I think that that helps us to see the larger picture of what this feedback means. So someone might say to me, "Miss Jai, you used this person's legal name. They don't go by that name." And instead of becoming defensive, instead of saying, this is the way that I'm trained, this is the way that I'm going to do it, I can say, "Oh, thank you for letting me know that," and I can move on through my day. Or if someone comes to me and they say, "Hey, Miss Jai, you prescribed this medication, and this patient is also on another medication related to gender affirmation and these are counterindicated, then I can say, oh, I didn't realize that. Thank you for catching that. Let's correct this information and I'll reach out to the patient directly. So it's a way for us to ultimately provide the best health services and set our patients and our clients up for the best possible health outcomes. And when I think of feedback as linked directly to that, then it becomes much easier for me to receive feedback and receive it graciously because ultimately the team is helping to improve my overall interaction with this individual, and having a team really feel invested in how I'm engaging with this individual is going to increase our rapport and increase the trust that we are building as a provider and a patient. All right. So the final question for today is, how do I change the attitudes and beliefs in my organization as just one person? This is a great question. They're all great questions. I say that after every question because they are all really great questions. I think the easiest way, or I think the most important thing to say about this is that as one person, we don't change our organizations. As one person, we don't change systems. Very rarely does one person have enough power within a system or within an organization to make any sort of realistic, sustainable, and impactful change to that system or to that organization. And so I think it's helpful for us then to think about, if we know that we don't have the power as an individual to create that change, how can we collaborate and organize in order to have more collective power to invest in that change, to make that change? So, the ways that we as individuals come together to change an organization and a system is by collaborating with other folks within that system, collaborating with folks outside of that system who can bring the needed information or the needed change in, organizing with stakeholders who are invested in the organization or in the system, invested in its success, invested in the ways that it functions, invested in the day-to-day activities, in the larger scale outcomes. We need folks from all of those levels so that we are able to see from multiple perspectives how we can bring this information in and make potential changes around that information. So, and I say that it needs to be folks both within the organization and folks outside of the organization, because even if we have folks within our organization who has this information that we're looking for, so I'll use myself as an example. Educating around gender diverse communities, educating around trans identity and non-binary identity. I have that knowledge and I have that information, and I can train on that information. And oftentimes within the organizations I worked in, I was asked to train on that information. But what ends up happening is that when you have one person in the organization who already has that information and then they are pushed into a spotlight amongst their peers, then they automatically become the funnel for all questions related to that topic. So I became the funnel to everything trans or non-binary. Folks would come to me in order to make complaints. Folks would come to me in order to get information, and it really moved us away from that collaborative structure where it's everyone's responsibility to get this information to it's one person's responsibility in this organization. And if you have any questions, go to that person. So I highly encourage that when you are looking to do things like trainings and education, when you are looking to do organizational shifts, so maybe it's changing forms, maybe it's changing the structure of a clinic, maybe it's changing the flow and functionality of that clinic, then I highly encourage bringing someone from the outside who can bring that information in and set you up and provide you with resources, because then it becomes a collective responsibility of folks to continue to learn this information and continue to invest in our health and wellness, the health and wellness of trans and non-binary people. It becomes the responsibility of everyone to look up this information when they don't know it. It becomes the responsibility of everyone to recognize when there are challenges with legal name versus current name or chosen name in an electronic medical record, and how that might be printing out on forms or on paperwork. And so when we don't have one expert of that, generally someone who's from that community, also being tokenized as an expert within that organization, it means that it requires other folks to take on and learn more about those pieces in order for it to be successful in the space. And then the other piece about collaborating outside of our organization means that we can also collaborate with the organizations and the groups, the grassroots groups, community led groups that are already doing this work in this community, and invest in those organizations as well. So if we are working with a trans advisory board, so an advisory board for trans and non-binary people that's made up of community members out in the community, then we are investing in their success by being able to provide direct information back to our organization. And we are showing them that we are willing to come to the community to learn more about how we can better provide services and what those services need to look like, as opposed to just listening insularly to what we believe needs to happen for our community for trans and non-binary people. So really organize, collaborate, work with folks within and outside of your organization, and find folks on multiple levels of stakeholders on multiple levels who can help to shift that needle, who can help to create that change, because really it becomes this collective piece that provides sustainable, measurable, impactful change, because we have folks who are from all levels of the organization invested in this. We have folks outside of the community who are aware that this is a problem, or outside of our organization that are aware that this is a problem and are saying that it needs to change. So we have stakeholder input from our consumers. We have stakeholder input from educators in our community who are saying they can bring us this information. So really, we're pre-packaging and bringing to the organization what needs to happen and how it needs to happen, and showing that there are already champions within the organization that are willing to dedicate the time and energy to spearheading that as well. And that's when we start to see shifts and change. And then recognizing also that sometimes our organizations are not set up in a way to provide us the support that we need. There are some organizations, some systems that have not been set up in ways that provide us with the ability to support trans and non-binary people. And so we have to also become creative in the workarounds that we develop, so that trans and non-binary people are still receiving services and are not excluded from services because the system is not built up to serve them. Whew, that was a lot. I want to thank you all for joining us for Ask Miss Jai Live. This has been a really great round of questions. If other questions come up, please don't hesitate to put them in the comments. I would love to hear from you. If you are catching this on the repeat, go ahead and put a hashtag replay and let me know what was the most impactful piece of this for you today. And then I want, again, my name is Miss Jai. I use feminine and masculine pronouns, she, her, and he, him. And I am very excited to be bringing you Ask Miss Jai Live. Next week, we're going to have a special guest from the US Trans Survey. So please join us next Sunday, September 4th at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time for the next Ask Miss Jai Live. Thank you so much, and thank you for investing in the health and wellness of transgender and non-binary communities.